And so it's a real blessing. I encourage you to get the book, Good Grief, Celebrate Your Life. And don't be fooled. I was really sad to hear there was already a book out there just called Good Grief. That's what I was going to call mine. And because that is a clever title, I got to say, because grief doesn't have to be all bad. It can be good because, when you love much, you grieve much. That is the price of love. When we love someone dearly, when they're no longer in our lives, we grieve for them. But I added celebrate your life because just as I was talking with this man last night, his mother's body was flown back to Nigeria to be buried there, and they never had a service here. And I told him, look, you need to plan a celebration. If you don't, you're going to get stuck. You'll be stuck in your grief.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. We're going to celebrate grief today in a new way. The book is called Good Grief, Celebrate Your Life, and Jason Harris is here on the podcast. I have the joy of talking to all of my guests ahead of time, and I left my initial conversation with Jason. He gave me some great tools, some great feedback, and some great thoughts on dealing with grief. And he's here to share his story with us and what he does for families. It's amazing. So grab a cup of coffee, sit down, and listen to this conversation because Jason's here. Jason, welcome to Living the Next Chapter.
Thank you so much, David. It is a pleasure to be here. I've been excited about this podcast in particular. So thank you for the invitation.
It's amazing. It's amazing to have you here. Again, the book is called Good Grief, Celebrate Your Life. Tell us where you are in this big world of ours, Jason.
Well, I'm just south of Arlington, Texas. That's where AT&T Stadium is, where the Cowboys sometimes win, sometimes they lose. And but I have been in Texas. I was born in Texas a very long time ago, 55 years ago. And but I've moved around. I've been in Wisconsin and Minnesota, North Carolina is where I got my master's degree. I've been in Oklahoma, been all around. So
good, awesome. Now you have a very interesting day job where you do things for people that a lot of people don't really realize how important it is until it actually happens in the moment. And we need someone like you that comes in and helps families in a time of grief. Can you explain, first, let's start with, how did you even get to do what you're doing? And then expand a little bit on what you do.
I appreciate it. It was such a bizarre turn of events. When I was only 18 years old, I accepted the call to ministry and became a licensed ordained minister at a very young age at 18. And entered youth ministry, love young people, always have, and student ministries, college ministries, things like that. I did some praise and worship, and then eventually became a pastor. And in my journey, I went to 5 years of Bible college, squeezed a 4-year degree into 5, and I had an emphasis in counseling, a minor in counseling, but biblical studies, pastoral ministries, that sort of thing. Went on to seminary in North Carolina, went to Southeastern Seminary, and got a master's degree, an MDiv, in, again, theology, biblical studies, and with an emphasis in counseling. But in all 8 years of that Bible training, of that preacher training, if you will, I had exactly one lecture, not one course, not one class, one lecture on doing funerals. And you would think that would be an integral part of preacher training. However, preachers are trained to preach. And in that one lecture, you're taught more or less funeral protocol, where to stand, lead the casket from the hearse to the burial site. Here's a dozen passages that are popular to speak on at funerals, like the John 14, let not your hearts be troubled. I go to prepare a place for you. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever in Psalm chapter 23. And we do not grieve as those who have no hope in 1 Thessalonians 4, and so forth. But the problem is, most families don't need a sermon. They need a celebration of the life of their loved one. And so preachers are more or less just trained to preach. And so I'm discovering that more and more. About 17 years ago, I won't go into the details of the turn of events, but I suddenly was outside of church ministries and got into sales of like home improvement, windows and siding and roofs and gutters and doors and that sort of thing. And then I was going to be moving back to Texas from Minnesota, where I was living at the time. And I knew I was going to need to do something in sales. Well, one of the prospects was pre-need funeral sales. And I thought, well, maybe that's about as exciting as watching paint dry. In fact, it sounds a little depressing. Why would I want to sell people funerals? And then I went to the presentation. I thought, wow, about 78% of people are unprepared for an unexpected death. And this is something that saves people thousands of dollars. And so I'm in. This is a great thing. So I became very good at selling pre-arranged funerals and got into the funeral business kind of by way of pre-need funeral sales. And so my job as the East Texas market sales manager was to meet funeral directors. Well, my ministry background got in the ears of these funeral directors, and they say, every now and then we have a family that doesn't have a church or a pastor or a church background or whatever, but they need someone to speak at the funeral. If we ever have that situation, would you be willing to do the funeral? I said, of course I would. And now, up until this point, David, almost every pastor is expected to do the funeral of someone in their church. Someone in the church dies, they do their funeral. The pastor does the funeral. They read words over them, as they say. But that's even the case if someone in their church's grandmother or second cousin twice removed or whoever passes away. And so then you've got a pastor speaking at a funeral that he's never met the person. And that usually ends up being a pretty bad funeral. Well, since word started getting around that Jason does a pretty good funeral, these funeral directors seem to all know each other. It's a pretty tight fraternity. And I began being asked to do funerals all the time for people I didn't know. And I thought, well, the only way I want to do a funeral like that is if I can interview the family. So if I'm going to interview the family, I need to come up with a series of questions. And so I developed 5 questions. And these 5 questions not only have served me so well in writing a eulogy that's going to be very personal, funeral directors began telling me, David, we've never heard so much laughter coming out of our chapel than when you do services here. In fact, the first 2 or 3 that I did, the laughing got so out of hand that the funeral director would peek in from the back of the auditorium like, what exactly is going on in here? And why are people laughing at a funeral? And it really had nothing to do with what I said. It was the answers to these questions. And when I discovered there were 3 or 4 other significant applications to these questions, I thought, you know what? I need to write this stuff down. And hence the book, Good Grief, Celebrate Your Life, was born in that case, or in that instance. And I began using that book not only to promote my talks and things, but to give families after I would do a funeral to help support, their grief journey.
Wow. How long has the book been out?
It was, I wrote it when we all had to shelter in place at the beginning of the pandemic. And so it was published in 2021, but I started writing it in February of 2020. And I was single at the time and had no place to go. And I thought, wow, I've got all these stories of things that have happened as a result of these 5 questions. And I looked down at my little dog and I said, Chewy, I'm going to write a book. And he looked up at me and said, all right, go for it. And so I had it written in about 6 or 7 weeks because that's all I worked on was this book. And so it's been, I've had some really remarkable feedback, even though I haven't done a lot of marketing for the book. I had one widow whose husband had died 5 years prior to her reading this book. And her husband not only died very suddenly, he died of a massive heart attack, and he also died on Christmas Eve, which was a double threat. And then the triple threat was that they had just had a major argument. And she was upstairs stewing, and he was downstairs in the kitchen stewing, and he had a massive heart attack and died, and there was no opportunity for, forgiveness after the accident, after the argument, and that sort of thing. And so she said for the first year or so after his passing, she would try to read everything she could get her hands on that was about grief. And she said, typically by about the second chapter of the book, I would slam the book shut and throw it across the room, angry, because it was so clinical, it was so textbook-like, and it was so predictable, and they were all the same. When I gave her my book, she was reluctant to take it because she said, I've read about this before. And I said, well, just read it and see what you think. She never put it down, sent me a selfie about 3:00 in the morning, and her face was all swollen and her eyes were red. And she said, I literally cried through every turn of the page. And now, don't let that discourage you from reading it. Don't say, I don't want to cry through every turn of the page. It may not resonate with you exactly the same way. But she said, honestly, I've never had anything help me this much. And she thanked me for it. And so I'm grateful for stories like that. There's another widow who endorsed the book who said, I've read many books on this subject, but I've never had anything reach my soul like yours had. I literally felt like you were having a conversation with me. And that's, the vernacular in which I wrote the book was as though I was sitting down with a reader over a cup of coffee and just talking about grief. So that's, I've been blessed by the comments and compliments, both from funeral directors and people who have read the book. But I do have a pretty unique approach to funerals.
Mm-hmm. So when you're sitting down with a family that you are just meeting for the first time, you don't know their story, you don't know the loss of the person in their family. What are some of the regrets that you hear come back to you from family members in a time of loss, in a time of grief? What are some of those familiar ones that kind of stand out where family members kind of lament that, oh, I wish I had more time, I wish I did this, I wish I did that? What kind of things are people saying to you in a time of loss?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure I've been asked that question on other podcasts, so I commend you for that. Many times it has a lot to do with the nature of the death. And what I will usually begin with, even if I'm doing an aftercare visit with a family whose funeral I didn't participate in, but also when I've been asked to meet with a family whose funeral I'm about to do, which I'm going to be speaking at one tomorrow. In fact, one of the first things I want to know was, how prepared were you for this death? Was this death expected or unexpected? Because it really changes the trajectory of someone's grief journey when someone goes to sleep and simply does not wake up, which was the case of the man who I sat with for about 2.5 hours last night, when he was recalling his mother had just gone to bed one night and she simply didn't wake up. I sat with a woman a few nights ago whose 18-year-old son left the house one morning. They had had an argument over him wearing mismatched socks, and he went to ride around with a friend of his. The car crashed, and she never saw him again until she was identifying him in the hospital. She said she knew it was her son before they ever lifted the sheet back because she saw his socks were mismatched, and it took her back to that moment. And so all that to say, when there's a sudden death, rather than a family that can gather around someone who's been in the hospital for 6 months or 6 weeks, and the doctors have said there's not much time left, go ahead and say your goodbyes, and that sort of thing. Those family members have the luxury of more or less closure, at least with the communication with that person. When they're suddenly taken from them, then the petty things over which they argued or fought, or that little thing which has kept them from speaking for the last 3 years, is suddenly very, very insignificant. And all that they think about is, how foolish was it that we weren't talking, or that we never smoothed that over, that we never sought forgiveness or granted forgiveness or whatever. And so rarely, and this is sounding very cliche, almost Hallmark card-like, but rarely do people talk about, I really wish I would have invested in that certain stock, or that I would have bought a nicer car or that I would have gone on a better vacation or anything else. It's all about relationships. It's all about, especially that one tenuous relationship or estranged relationship that I really wish I would have gotten right.
As you deal with people in a time of loss, I'm sure there's times where you head back out to your car or drive back home, sit down, put the keys on the counter, and you're like dealing with loss all the time and hearing these stories, heartbreaking stories. It must change the way that you live your life.
Oh my God.
Knowing that you're seeing the result of a life lived differently, you must come home and think, man, I want to do this with my life. I want to do more of this, or I want to. It just must give you a new focus for yourself personally.
That is so insightful, and it's amazing that you're recognizing that. Last night, spending 2.5 hours with this man who had lost his mother, and she was taken back to Nigeria, where she was from, and is not going to be buried until the 1st of June, which is a remarkable, astounding thing. And I won't go into all the details of that story, but through the course of our visit, he told me, he said, I want you to know that not only do I feel that you're very gifted at what you do, and I knew that when I received your call for the first time that I needed to speak with you, but you need to understand that I am literally a different person right now than I was 2.5 hours before you knocked on the door. And I feel that such a burden has been lifted. And that is so, it means more to me than I could ever express. But the other thing that it did in my heart was I did come home and I sat down next to my wife, who lost her mother 5 years ago. And it really sharpened my focus to know here is something that I know that I'm gifted in. And last Sunday was Mother's Day. And I don't believe that I was nearly as sensitive about my own wife's loss of her mother from 5 years ago. Mm. And it really, I told my wife, I said, I just want to apologize to you. And I feel so convicted that, that I've not spent this same intensity and compassion over you not having your mother on Mother's Day than I did with this man who was a perfect stranger to me before this evening. And sometimes it does that, but it also, the reason that one of my talks that I would love to do, have been to any of your listeners, if you would like for me to come speak at your church or community event or a convention, or if you're a funeral director and have a funeral directors association, anything like that, I'd love to get the word out. And I have a talk called 5 Questions That Will Change Your Life. Now, the reason I call it that is not because I think necessarily that these 5 questions are the end-all, be-all magic words that, will forever be change the face of funerals. But it is the very thing that you just said, David, is that it really does. It challenges myself after using these questions to write a eulogy, and using these questions to bring comfort to someone who has experienced a loss. And the other applications to these questions are literally life-changing. The life-changing application, though, is the final application that I talk about in the book, and that is when we turn the questions in on ourselves introspectively. And so that's a little bit like what I was talking about, what happened with me last night. It's not only do you consider how this is helpful to the person that I'm talking with, but that it really challenges my own personal life as well.
I love it. So, okay, let's talk, Jason, to the people that are listening that are going to be going to a funeral in the next week or so. Mm-hmm. Extended family, they're going to show up for the family. They're going to be there and support it, celebrating this life that's passed. They want to be there for the family. Talk a little bit about our role as community at a funeral.
Okay.
Attending. I would love to know what we can do. Yeah. Because one thing you mentioned to me when we had our pre-chat was the family is numb through all of this. They're potentially not even going to remember you're there.
Exactly.
So how can we show up, be a great community member during the funeral? And then I want to dig into something you shared from the book, which is a great idea of what we can do in the future. But as far as attending our next funeral
Yeah,
as a community member, family member, extended, how can we show up? What can we do?
that's such a great question. I'm so eager to answer it because just as surely as I've discovered that pastors are not taught to do funerals, people are not taught what to do at funerals either. And
Right.
so we attend funerals with the excitement of chewing on aluminum foil. I mean, it's like it's a necessary evil. It's like, okay, well, I've got to go to this funeral and there's very possibly going to be a dead body present, and that's going to make me feel weird and funky, and I'm not going to know what to say to anyone. And so just like if you've attended funerals and you've seen it as something performative where a pastor who perhaps may not even know the decedent gets up and performs a funeral and shifts into reverend, even change their voice somehow to where they sound like we are gathered here. And they just
Yeah.
sound remorseful and sad and morose, and it's awful. And I never understood that. The same token, by the same token, the people who are gathered, all they've kind of picked up on throughout life and movies and lines from TV shows and things like that are just various cliches. And I'm sure if you're listening to this, you've been guilty of saying something to someone who's lost a loved one that is along the lines of, at least he's in a better place, or at least he's not suffering anymore, or at least he lived 82 years, or whatever. And anything that starts with at least, I promise you, is not going to land well with the hearer. And especially if you say something like, I know how you feel, you should be punched in the throat for a statement. And so the truth is
Yeah.
the family, just like you said, David, is numb at the funeral service, and they are still in that stage of denial. And I use that loosely to say stage. I know that Kubler-Ross has given us the 5 stages of grief, and but the truth of the matter is, even though there's overlap with everyone's grief journey, I always say one thing about grief is that it is as unique as our fingerprints. There are no two people on this planet that grieve the same way. That's why you should never say, I know how you feel to anybody. Even if someone just lost their mother and you've lost your mother, you can't say, I know how you feel, because you didn't lose their mother, you lost your mother. And so it's still different. And so what do I say to grieving people? The truth is, it's nothing about what you say that's going to make any difference. It's how you're going to make them feel. It's how will I make them feel. One of my favorite chapters in my book, Good Grief, Celebrate Your Life, is the 9th chapter, which is called Lessons from a Hobbit, a Grief Dog, and a Box of Matches. And I would unpack that entire chapter if I had time, but we don't. You're going to have to read it for yourself, but it's all analogous to the importance of staying on the journey with the family. So it's one thing to go to a funeral and realize the family really doesn't even know that you're there. That's why the funeral home gives them a book with your signature in it and everyone else's who attended the funeral. I've talked to so many people who say, you know what, I haven't even opened that book back up. I've not even looked at that book. And even if they did, they would say, you would hear them say out loud, oh, wow, I didn't see them there. Oh, I didn't remember them being there. Oh, they came from 2 states over. My gosh, I can't believe I don't even have a memory of them being there. And the truth is, they are in this surreal fog. They're sitting there on the first 3 or 4 rows, staring at a casket or an urn saying, is this really happening right now? Is that really my mother up there, or my father? Am I really in a funeral home chapel right now? Meanwhile, you're on autopilot saying to guests, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support and all of that. So one of the things I've started doing at the end of a service is I'll get up with a box of matches. And I've made typically about 60 to 80. Sometimes the most I've ever made for a huge crowd was 200 of these matchboxes. Now I get these 10 for 97 cents at Walmart. And so it's just 32 wooden matches in a box. And they're just common kitchen matches. But I make labels that on one side is the photograph of their loved one. And on the other side, there are things that characterize things that they love, their life. I just did one last Saturday for a woman who loves the Dallas Mavericks basketball team. And so I had the logo of the Dallas Mavericks on the back. She also loved camping with her kids, with her grandkids, rather. And so there was a picture of a pup tent, camping scene. She also loved to sew. And so there was a little sewing machine on it. So what's the point? I get up and I take these matchbox and I say to all of you who have come to this funeral today, on behalf of the family, I want to thank you. But I'm going to tell you something that you may or may not realize. They don't know you're here. And I explained that. I explained that if I ask anybody on the first 3 or 4 rows in this family, in a week or two, name me 5 people who were at your mother's funeral, I will literally get deer in the headlights. They'll be like, okay, well, now I know now let's see. And it's not that they don't appreciate you being there. Of course they do. It's just that they're in that fog. And so, but then I also add, now in a couple of weeks, the first real tsunami of grief is going to knock them off their feet, and the Novocaine is going to wear off, and this numbness is going to be gone. And they're going to say, wow, this really hurts, when they pick up their phone to start to dial their mother and remember that she's no longer here. And so I said, when that realization occurs and when that tsunami of grief hits them, all of you are going to be back to work. You're not going to be around anymore. And so there are many families, and listeners, please hear this. So many families feel abandoned after the funeral. You say, oh, wow, but I spent $200 on flowers or whatever. Those flowers are going to be dead in 2 weeks. I hate to tell you that, but it's a fact. But if you'll take one of these matchboxes home with you and put it in your kitchen junk drawer, because I know you got one. Yeah. Maybe you have 3, and that's okay. Put it in your favorite one. So that throughout the year, when this family is going through all of their first Mother's Day, first Father's Day, first Christmas, first Thanksgiving, first birthday, when I do an intake with a family that I'm going to do the funeral for, I not only get everyone's name and how they were related to this loved one, but I get their birthdays. I get information from them of when they believe that they're really going to struggle with grief the most. The man I talked with last night said every Sunday I called my mother. Every Sunday we talked for sometimes 2 or 3 hours, but that was our ritual. So I know that every Sunday is going to be difficult for me. And so I say, when you take these matchboxes home and put them in your kitchen junk drawer, I want you to realize that throughout the year, as you go to light birthday candles or dinner candles or a fire in the fireplace or to light the charcoal over a barbecue grill, or if you're just going for that pair of scissors or that roll of tape and you see this matchbox, you don't need the matchbox to remember the person who passed. We're always going to remember them, but will you reach out to their daughter, to their son, to their best friend, to their cousin, to their uncle, to whoever in the family? And this is all I want you to say. I want you to say, hey, remember those matches that the weird bald guy gave us at your mother's funeral? I want you to know we use those today, and we sure miss her. I said, now listen, if you're planning on saying something stupid, you don't get a matchbox. I don't even want you to take one. Because if what you're going to say even begins with at least, don't take a matchbox. Because they don't want to hear that. They don't want you to call them in 2 weeks and say, how are you doing? I know you mean well when you say that. And many of you listening saying, gosh, I say that all the time. Think about it. A grieving person is forced to answer your cliche with a cliche, because they'll answer that question. I can tell you right now, well, I have good days or bad days. I have, I'm just taking it a day at a time or whatever, because they're trying to spare you the answer that they're feeling while I cry all the time. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's so important just to let the person talk about their loved one. And that's really the whole point of the grief dog that I talk about. I got to work with the first certified grief dog in the state of Texas a few years ago, and there's a picture of her in my book, and it's a big old golden doodle named Libby. And Libby is amazing. If she is working at visitation at Karate Funeral Home in Belton, Texas, she will find someone who is grieving because she can sense it, and she knows that she'll sit right down at the feet of a widow and put her big fluffy head in her lap, and she'll look up at her. And when I talk about Libby at my seminars, I say, you know what she says? And people literally look like, oh, wait a minute, let me get my pen ready. I need to write this down because this is going to be amazing. Because they paid thousands of dollars for this grief dog and her training.
Yeah, yeah.
And the truth is, I say, she doesn't say anything. She's a dog. Dogs don't talk. And so the reason she's so effective, and the reason you can be so much more effective when you're with someone who's grieving, is that you just sit there with them. And then everything about her body language says, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to sit with you and just let you cry. And so many people are uncomfortable with someone else's grief. And I just urge you, just get in their bucket with them and hurt with them and listen to them. Let them talk. And so we really haven't even talked about the 5 questions yet. But I can rattle those off for you real quick.
I would love for you to share them. And I want everyone to go buy the book, Good Grief, as well. But yeah, let's do the questions. I love it.
Okay. So in Good Grief Celebrates Your Life, one of the early chapters, about the 3rd chapter, I say, may I ask you a few questions, because that's what kicked off the whole inspiration for this book. And what began as just an interview to help me write a personalized eulogy for someone I didn't know, turns out this is a tremendous series of questions to ask someone when you find out that their loved one has passed away. And so the first question I asked David is, what did you call this person? I'm looking for terms of endearment, because if someone would have gotten up at my grandmother's funeral and talked about Mabel Lee Harris because they were handed an obituary 15 minutes before the service started, I would have thought, I don't know who you're talking about, because
who's that?
I didn't call her by her first name. Not in the South, especially in Tennessee, I would have got my jaw handed back to me. And so that was my mamaw. And when somebody talks about mamaw instead of Mabel Lee Harris, then my mind immediately goes to her chocolate-covered tea cakes and her train wreck ballads and Froggy went a-courtin' and all the stories she used to tell and us staying over at her house at night and all the fun. I want to hear terms of endearment, terms of familiarity, nicknames, things like that. What did the grandkids call them? And then the second question is, if you could describe her with just one word, what would that be? And it's amazing to me, David. I've tried this both ways. I've been with 10 family members and said, look, write down your answer and then we'll read them. And I've also just said, let's go round robin and just answer me. There can be 10 different family members and I will almost always get 10 different answers. And they're all right. But one of my favorite parts about this question is when I'm sharing the answers at the eulogy, you see the family writes the eulogy. They just don't realize they're the authors of the eulogy. And I'm just mashing them all together and sharing these answers. But when I've read my list, I can look out at the crowd and say, what are we leaving out? I'm not asking for speech. I'm asking for one word. And so it's like popcorn all over the chapel. You hear people say, she was amazing. She was beautiful. She was kind. She was loving. She was sweet. She was funny. And then some start to relax enough to plant their tongue in their cheek and say, she was sassy. You know what? She was a little stubborn. She was strong-willed and things like that. And people begin to chuckle and you feel the room just relax. And it's really an amazing transformation. And then I get into the third question of what's one of your favorite memories of or with this person? And that could be, I love fishing with my dad. I love going to garage sales with my mom or whatever. But you'll also get stories of, I'll never forget the time that this happened. And that's almost always something hilarious. And so that's where even more laughter starts to erupt while people are still pushing tears out of their eyes because they're remembering this amazing loved one. And then the fourth question is, what is a life lesson that you gained having had him or her in your life? either through something they've always said, something they've always done, the way they live their life. Say, I probably do this because of him or her. My papa always said you should always have a pocket knife in your pocket. You never know when you might need a pocket knife. And so someone might say, I carry a pocket knife because of my papa, because of my grandpa, or whatever. And then finally, I ask, if this person could speak to you just one more time, what would he say to you now? What would she say to you now? And that, I'm telling you, is probably the most emotive question. That's where a lot of times the tears just start to fall. But it's not tears of sorrow or regret or pain or anything. It's just the realization, well, they really can't say anything to me now. But if they were here, I know they would say, I love you. I miss you. You're special. I'm so proud to have been called your father, your mother, or whatever. And so the first time I was flying somewhere, after I developed these 5 questions, and I sat down next to someone on the plane. If you're sitting next to me on a plane, you're open season. I love talking to people, meeting people. I am that guy that you probably asked to be reassigned to another seat. But what I discovered is everybody that I have answered the question when they say, Jason, what do you do? And I look at them and say, well, as strange as this is going to sound, I professionally speak at funerals, and I love it. I'm passionate about it. They look at me like, you need a better hobby than that. And then, but I tell them one of the reasons I do is because I love helping families celebrate the life of their loved one, and I'm very passionate about grief support in their grief journey. Almost everyone I've ever said that to, including the very first time that I'm telling you about, respond with, wow, where were you 2 years ago when my mother died? Or they will tell me immediately about someone they've lost. And what naturally fell out of my mouth was, do you mind if I ask you a few questions about your mother? And I've never had anybody say, no, I don't want to talk about her. They're surprised that you ask, because that's very counterintuitive. Most of us would just change the subject because I don't want you to cry. That might make me uncomfortable. And so I found that over the next 10 or 15 minutes, as I went through the 5 questions and letting them talk and tell me about their mother, their loved one, that we're soon laughing together. And then when I asked that last question, we're crying together. And David, I have had several times where we exchange phone numbers, and 3 hours after we land, I'll get a text message that says, you have no idea how much I needed that. And so it's a real blessing. I encourage you to get the book, Good Grief, Celebrate Your Life. And don't be fooled. I was really sad to hear there was already a book out there just called Good Grief. That's what I was going to call mine. Because that is a clever title, I got to say, because grief doesn't have to be all bad. It can be good because, when you love much, you grieve much. That is the price of love. When we love someone dearly, when they're no longer in our lives, we grieve for them. But I added celebrate your life because just as I was talking with this man last night, his mother's body was flown back to Nigeria to be buried there, and they never had a service here. And I told him, look, you need to plan a celebration. If you don't, you're going to get stuck. You'll be stuck in your grief. I said, so let's plan something. If you said she's going to be buried in Nigeria on the 1st of June, have a celebration here in Texas. Have a celebration with your family, with your loved ones, with your friends. I said, I'll be happy to come and lead that celebration. He said, you know what? We're going to do that. And if you would be willing to do that for us, we would be honored to have you. And I'd be more than honored to do that. And I'm excited about it because when you celebrate the life of your loved one, the grief journey is going to be better than if you didn't at all. Because time by itself does not heal all wounds. That is a misnomer. Don't believe it. If I fell down the stairs and had a compound fracture in my leg, and David, if you came over to me and said, don't worry, Jason, I hear that time will heal. You just propped me up in the corner and said, let's just wait a few weeks. I would end up losing the leg to infection and everything else and the circulation, and because several things need to happen. I probably need surgery and a cast and physical therapy after the muscles atrophy when I get the cast off and everything else, because all of those things plus time will heal. But if you don't do anything to help you navigate your grief journey, you're going to be as about as much trouble as you would if you didn't do anything but just wait for a compound fracture to get better, because it's not going to. So you need resources. You need to have some help navigating a journey that you've never experienced. I mean, someone who loses their mother, they've never lost their mother before, and so it's uncharted territory, and we do need help.
I love it. Okay, so Jason, before we go, your website, contact information. I know there's going to be people wanting to talk to you for sure. Where can we get the book? Can you tell us where we need to go to do all these things?
Absolutely. The easiest place to find me is a very easy website. It's called www.speakerjason.com. Literally my name, speakerjason.com. And there is a link to that on that website to get the book. You can get the book from there. You can get the book from on Audible, on Yahoo. I'm sorry, on Amazon. That's what I'm trying to think of. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble and other places like that. But speakerjason.com. I would love to come and speak at your venue. Perhaps if you have a podcast, someone else, I'd be happy to be a guest on your show as well. I'm so grateful for this one. And but yes, if you go to speakerjason.com, there's a direct link to getting the book there. And also, if you'd like to contact me to come and speak at your school, at your church, at any affiliation, I would love to do that. In fact, I'm happy to speak at someone's funeral. And I will go just about anywhere to do that very thing, or to at least help coach someone through preparing a eulogy.
I love it. So, in keeping in theme with your questions, as we close off, Jason, what do you want people to pop up and say about you when you leave this world? What are your hopes and dreams? What do you want people to think of when they hear Jason Harris come up in conversation? What do you want them to say?
That is a tremendous question, and which is why I call the 5 questions that will change your life just that, because the last application is, what would I say if I turn these questions in on myself? What are my terms of endearment? I don't have any grandkids yet, and I'm not even sure what my grandpa name will be, but I believe it's going to be my favorite, just like my father's grandpa name is Papa. That's music to his ears. But that second question is so crucial. If you could describe Jason with just one word, what would it be? What do I hope that would be? And more importantly, am I being it? I hope that people would say, well, he had a great sense of humor. He was funny. But I hope they say he was passionate, that he really loved truth and really was passionate about helping people. And I hope that the memories that are shared are great memories. And by the way, I hope that you're taking time to make memories with your loved ones. So important. And the 4th question, am I teaching life lessons? Am I teaching people? And see, that's what I want to do with Morning into Dancing. That's the name of my company. And that's not morning as opposed to evening. It's MOURNING, Morning into Dancing. What I want to teach the lessons of helping people through their grief and how that can be done, and to break the traditional norms of funerals the way we've seen them done for decades, that really leaves nothing but sorrow and sadness and solemnity. But that final question, if you ask yourself, if I was suddenly taken out of this world in a car accident, brain aneurysm, and just suddenly passed away, what is that one thing I really wish that I could go back and say to my spouse, to my kids, to my best friend? And when you have that answer in your mind, just stop what you're doing and text that person. That's even what I say in my book. When I get to that point, I say, listen, why don't you put the book down for a minute? I'll be here when you get back. But put the book down long enough to send a text to your daughter, to your son, to your spouse, to your friend, and say, if I haven't told you lately, if I haven't told you enough, I want you to know I love you. You're special. It's amazing being your father. I'm so grateful that you're my wife. And say it Say it while you have the opportunity. Write it down and make sure that they know it. So really turning these questions in on myself, and David, thank you for the encouragement to do it again, is the thing that will change your life about these questions. And if you get them down to where, I can rattle off these questions in my sleep now, and it comes so naturally that if I'm asked to do a eulogy 20 minutes from now, I'll be able to do it if I can use these questions live and just ask family members to celebrate their loved one. So you can have good grief and celebrate your life.
Excellent. Jason, thank you so much for being part of the podcast. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for what you do for families. I'm sure there's a long line of people that have some very kind words to say about what you do and how you treat them in a time of grief, in a time of confusion and numbness, how you come into the family, sit down with them and bring light into a very dark time. And I think you'd be surprised at some of the words they would say about you, about your kindness, your generosity, your humility, your gentleness. I think all those things are the things we need more of in this world. So thank you for demonstrating those in your book and what you do as well.
Thank you so much, David. And if any of you would like to share any comments with me, my email address is very easy as well. My first name is Nick, and so there's an N in front of jason.harris@gmail.com. So njason.harris@gmail.com, or you can find me at speakerjason.com. I look forward to hearing from you. I'd love to come and speak at your organization. And yeah, let's get that set up, and the sooner the better.
Awesome. Everyone, all the information will be in the show notes as always. Please reach out to Jason and again, buy the book. I love the fact there's an audio version as well. Share it with family members. It's a great thing. If you have anybody that works in the funeral industry, they need to get a copy of this book as well. So please spread the word about this great book and let's get it into more hands. Jason, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, David. It's been an honor.
Thanks for being part of the podcast again. Appreciate you investing time in the show and you for listening this far. Thank you. One thing to keep in mind is we are looking for help and some support for the podcast. If you are able to help support our show, our little podcast show here, we can go over to livingthenextchapter.com and all the instructions will be there to help support the show. It takes about $30 to $40 a month to do this, just for the hosting and all of that other stuff that we pay for. But if the show is giving you any value and you're enjoying what's happening here, would love any kind of support that you can offer. That would be great. And you being here and sharing the show helps us grow, helps us get great new authors on the show, connect with other listeners, and build community. So whatever you can do to share this show today, I really appreciate it. Thank you for being here for Living the Next Chapter, and I can't wait to share the next one with you. Talk soon. Have a great day.